So now we're going to shift our focus to the next significant migration flow of Asians following the Chinese. As we now know, they're purged for the most part from the West Coast, yet you still see American industrialists needing cheap labor, regardless of where it originates from. What matters most is not race, but economics, right, in the eyes of the industrialists. So they would seek a different Asian cheap labor force, and that would be the Japanese immigrants coming in the late 19th century. And I should mention to a lesser degree Koreans, but is predominantly composed of Japanese immigrants. And they're arriving in the late 19th century and early 20th century. There is some overlap with some Chinese coming too. In fact, we just talked about the paper sons in the early 20th century, but we have to also remember that this is largely curbed, the immigration flow of Chinese, that is, after 1882. So let's do a little bit of recap. We know that most Asian immigration is going to the American West. We keep emphasizing the West in this topic. And we even mentioned that westward expansion was indeed commercial expansion, right? More so than civilization, quote unquote, coming to tame the Wild West, right? As if there's a division or dividing line between the two areas. And, we know that there's a need for cheap labor, according to the industrialists. And the Pacific region would be the source of that cheap labor. Now, let's also remember that there's Western presence in Asia to recruit those laborers. We talked about the Guangdong province, how there's European and American commercial interests there, but in Japan we'll see the same case. So my whole point is, on both sides of the Pacific, you see this network happening, right, that's going to facilitate this movement, going to actualize it, actually. Okay, so we need to talk about the push and pull factors leading to Japanese immigration. So we need to ask ourselves, in other words, what's happening in Japan by the mid 1800s that would tie in with Japanese migration to the United States West? And to understand this, it brings us to an important chapter in the history of Japan. And that's something called, over here, the Meiji Restoration. And basically, this was an immense and rapid program to modernize Japan, okay, to take it out of the feudal world and into the modern world. And like I said, it's rapid. They want to do this very fast, right? If you think about modernization in Europe, for example, it takes centuries, but they want to do this overnight, it seems. Why do they want to pursue this? It's because they want to stave off the possibility of Western colonialism, like what's happening all over the globe. They don't want to become subject to Western domination. So what they do is adopt modernization, in other words, westernization, you could call it back then. They adopt a Western institutions, Western practices. They're going to stave off that possibility by doing what Westerners do, okay, which is modernizing. And eventually they'll even become an empire, just like other European empires, and they'll seek their own colonies. And, this takes us into World War II. But in any case, that's what's happening with the modernization program called the Meiji Restoration. They want to modernize their economics. In other words, they want to pursue mass industrialization. They want to modernize their politics. They want to introduce parliamentary systems. They'll still retain the emperor, but, side by side with that, they'll have an emperor, a parliament. They want to modernize their military, right? They want to get rid of the feudal samurai class, in other words, and replace it with a modern military as we know it today, rank and file soldiers and modern weaponry. By the way, you may have seen that movie called The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. This is what it touches upon, right? They want to modernize all aspects of life, infrastructure, and so forth. Okay. This is an immense project, as I mentioned, but it's going to wield upheavals and dislocation in Japanese society during this time. Um, what's happening here? First of all, in this program to modernize, it's going to entail this mammoth expense to do this expenditure. So, how is the Meiji state, which of course is the government in charge of this modernization program, how are they going to raise the revenue for this um, undertaking? Well, 90% of their revenue will come from this land tax that they implement. And the tax was basically something new because in the feudal era, you paid taxes, of course, but you paid it to the local lord, right? The shogun, whatever. But here, it's the government, a modern government, just like we have our federal government, right? Now they have a modern centralized government, and they need to pay that. And it's going to cause upheaval in the peasant class, particularly, in the rural areas. Great numbers of farmers are going to be dispossessed of their land for failure to pay this enormous tax during the 1880s. And then added to that, you see the Meiji state passing a national conscription law. Conscription. So what is conscription? It's basically using the draft to, you know, to, um, populate their army, right? They're modernizing their military, let's recall, as I mentioned. So they want to modernize it. So therefore, they, draft commoners, in fact, former peasants, right, to replace that feudal warrior class, as I mentioned, the samurai, right? That's dissolved now. But many of these peasants don't want to join the military. They want to avoid military service, the mandatory service. So, these two upheavals, and there are quite a few others, by the way, that associate with the Meiji program, but these were significant in precipitating immigration to the United States. Failure to pay the land tax, therefore becoming dispossessed, dislocated in Japanese society, and moreover, trying to avoid conscription or being drafted. Um, then you see other push factors involved that are actually similar to China. Not only political, but even in terms of natural disasters, you see happening around this time in the late 19th century, massive earthquakes and other natural disasters that cause, poverty, starvation. But as I also mentioned, you see, particularly in the southwest region of Japan, the concentration of some American business and commercial interests that are, again, forming commercial ties with Japan. Because why? Japan is now modernizing its economy, and the United States sees this as a crucial door into the markets of Japan, right? So you see things like import export businesses starting to rise. But my whole point is that there are American business interests in this part of Japan. And, eventually you'll see something called the Irwin Convention. And the Irwin Convention is so named after Robert Walker Irwin, who influential businessman back then, who went to Southwest Japan um, to try to recruit plantation workers in Hawaii, which we'll talk about, but also to the U.S. West. Okay, so once the Irwin Convention was passed in 1886, you see now a steady stream. There were some small streams before the Irwin Convention, but now you see a steady stream of Japanese migrating to both Hawaii and the sugar plantations, that is, and in the U.S. West. All right. So this was not something new in Japan, by the way, this sojourning experience. Okay, remember sojourners from China we discussed. They were voluntary workers. You could also call them contract workers. Well, there's this tradition in Japan called dekasegi, and that's spelled Dekasegi. And if you're reading the text, Erica Lee, you should remember that. Hopefully, you remember encountering that in your reading. But this is the practice of Japanese laborers leaving their native place temporarily, that is, to work elsewhere. But it was known as internal migration, internal in Japan. But now you're extending it beyond the borders of Japan, the dekasegi tradition, to go to, the U.S. West and Hawaii too. So this is taking place, by 1886, as we mentioned. All right. Here we have this term that I introduced earlier with the Chinese. And agribusiness, as I mentioned, is basically the commercialization of agriculture, of farming. Farming is big business because, the market is taking over that small family farm that was for the agricultural institution that was primary in feeding the average person. Now it's the market. As we know today, we can't avoid the market when we get hungry, right? Somehow intersects with the market. So this is going to lead to places around the Pacific, right? Whether it's the U.S. Western coast or Hawaii, that are going to attract these new flow of Japanese.